Welcome to While We Were Distracted, the podcast where we explore topics that often get overshadowed in the rush of daily life.
Today, we are opening up a source stack that it really shows a remarkable and frankly alarming challenge facing American national security. And it all starts with a number that should really startle you, 278,000.
Yeah, that's the official count of improper searches. Searches on a U.S. intelligence database that was, explicitly designed to target foreign threats, not people here at home.
It really is the perfect encapsulation of the intelligence dilemma, isn't it?
It is, because on one hand, you have this tool that the government insists is just vital. They say it stops sophisticated terrorist plots, that it's prevented bombings right here in America.
But then on the other hand, you have the documentation showing this widespread systemic abuse on the inside. It's created a huge legal and political problem.
A massive liability.
So that's our mission today. We're going to dive deep into the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Court, the FISC, and its findings on Section 702 of FISA.
And we have to scrutinize the FBI's role here, especially with the accusations aimed directly at Director Christopher Wray.
And then there's the political fallout from all this. The claims about the deep state, the breakdown of trust, it's all in there.
Yeah, we're looking at court rulings, intelligence reports, and some really passionate commentary from sources who believe these abuses are an existential threat to our civil liberties.
Okay, let's unpack this.
Let's do it.
For anyone who might be just catching up on this, it's a highly technical area. So let's start with the basics. What is FISA, and what exactly is this Section 702 power?
So the foundation is the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act. It was set up to govern how the U.S. can legally conduct surveillance for, foreign intelligence purposes.
And it's all overseen by that secretive court, the FISC.
Right. And if the government wants to surveil a known agent of a foreign power who is on American soil, well, that requires what's called a Title I warrant.
And the important thing for you to remember about that is the standard. For a Title I warrant, the level of evidence is probable cause.
The exact same level of evidence you would need to get a warrant on, say, a domestic bank robber.
It's meant to be a high bar. It has to be, because surveillance is so intrusive.
Exactly. Now, Section 702 is completely different. And this is really the crux of the whole problem.
How so?
Section 702 lets the government collect communications of non-Americans who are located outside the United States. And they can do it without an individualized warrant.
So it's designed to just hoover up data on overseas threats.
That's the idea. And the critical legal firewall is that the government is explicitly not supposed to use this powerful warrantless tool to target Americans here in the U.S.
And yet here we are. That firewall seems to have just collapsed, which brings us back to those huge numbers.
It does.
Now, we've seen a couple of figures mentioned, 278,000 and 274,000. Can you clarify which is which? What's the court finding versus the political claim?
That's a great question, and the distinction is really key here. The official figure, the one released by the ODNI...
The Office of the Director of National Intelligence.
Right. Based on the FISC ruling, that number is 278,000 improper searches of the database over several years. That is the court's finding.
So that's the official documented failure.
Yes. But then you have this very direct, very serious political accusation from the source material. It claims FBI Director Christopher Wray was caught last year illegally using 702 collection methods against Americans 274,000 times.
Okay, so 278,000 is the court's view of the systemic failure over time, and 274,000 is the number critics are using to specifically target Wray's leadership.
Pretty much. But either way, the violation is just profound.
So why? Why did the court find these hundreds of thousands of searches improper?
Well, it's because in all of those cases, the court found there was no reasonable basis to expect they would return foreign intelligence or evidence of crime.
Even though the FBI was arguing that it was reasonably likely they'd find something.
Exactly. The court just flatly disagreed with that justification. This isn't just a technicality. It's using a foreign intelligence tool for general domestic searches. It's what's known as a backdoor search.
Here's where it gets really interesting. We've got the scope of the violation. But what was the motivation? Where was the FBI aiming these searches?
The targets were incredibly high profile and very, very domestically charged. The court ruling, for instance, detailed improper searches that happened during the investigations into the Jan 6 Capitol riots.
Wow. So they were looking for communications related to American citizens involved in Jan 6, but using a foreign surveillance tool to do it?
Precisely. They also improperly searched the database during investigations into the protest after the 2020 killing of George Floyd.
And just general crime investigations too, right? Between 2016 and 2020.
Yes, it shows a pattern. A tool meant for, transnational terrorism was repurposed and abused to respond to domestic political and social events. And it often bypassed the probable cause standard you'd need for a normal domestic case.
And we need to stress, for you, the listener, how an American's data even gets in this database.
That's the key mechanism.
The warrant is on the foreign target, but if that target was talking to you, an American citizen, your communications get swept up and stored too.
Exactly. If you're texting a foreign target, a terrorist, a spy, your side of the conversation is collected without a warrant on you. The abuse happens when an analyst then decides, without probable cause, to search the database using your name or phone number.
For a domestic fishing expedition.
That's what it is.
I mean, this just flies in the face of history. We all remember cases like Carter Page during the Russiagate investigation. That required a Title I warrant.
And for good reason.
The whole point of that high standard is because surveillance against Americans is so fundamentally intrusive. These searches just, circumvented it.
That's the accusation. Now, the official counterargument is that the Bureau caught its own mistakes. The ODNI stated the FBI tightened its procedures in mid-2021 and 2022.
So they're saying the problem is fixed.
They're asserting that these past incidents do not reflect their current practices.
That official defense has not quieted the political firestorm, though, especially with FISA 702 being up for reauthorization.
No, it hasn't. And this is where the frustration from critics, especially those in our sources who have been on the receiving end of these powers, it just boils over.
Because they see a pattern. They argue that even after exposing these detailed abuses going back to Russiagate, Congress failed to implement any real structural reform.
They really did.
So what happened in that reauthorization battle? Did Congress actually add more oversight?
The analysis in our source material is deeply, deeply critical. It claims the House Republican majority essentially bent the knee.
And just reauthorized the power.
Reauthorized it after the FBI director assured them, no, don't worry, we fixed everything, we're good. The argument is that Congress knew the scale of the abuse and still chose to kick the can down the road.
That alleged lack of accountability, I mean, that's what leads to the really strong language we see in the surface about institutional rot, the claims about a deep state.
The viewpoint is extreme, but it reflects that frustration. They claim the FISA abuse led to a revolt in this country. One critic even said that the mob in government is worse than the mob that Whitey Bulger ran.
That's an incredible statement.
It is. It frames the abuse as so pervasive that, you need books and movies just to explain how this deep state mechanism works. It's a total collapse of faith.
And the sources personalize this. They bring up the experience of Kash Patel, saying federal subpoenas and grand jury tools were used to surveil him. This really shows how it works in practice, doesn't it?
It does. It shows the mechanics. When the government wants your data, they don't seize your phone. They go to Apple or Google or Verizon with a warrant or a subpoena.
And the companies have to comply.
They do. And the most insidious part from the critic's perspective is the silence, the gag order.
Right. The government tells the company, you are prohibited from telling this person you're turning over their information.
Exactly. That invisibility is what makes the abuse so destructive. The target can't challenge the search because they don't even know what happened. Maybe for years or maybe never.
It's a picture of tools meant for foreign enemies being turned inward. But okay, this brings us to the big dilemma. If the tool is this corrupted, can we really afford to scrap it?
That's the pivotal question.
If FISA goes away, what happens to our ability to counter genuine foreign threats?
And even the harshest critics we're looking at agree that the tool itself is necessary. They say it needs major reform, but they don't say get rid of it. You can't just dismiss the need for foreign intelligence collection. Not in today's world.
And speaking of threats, the sources mention some statistics about the border that raise some serious questions.
Yes. There's a specific claim that Director Wray and Secretary Mayorkas testified to Congress that only 24 known foreign terrorists came into America through the border and were then lost. Lost by U.S. authorities. And the source's reaction was just disbelief. You have these powerful surveillance tools, but you're losing known threats inside the country.
It compounds the issue. The tools are abused domestically, but they seem ineffective against clear, known external dangers.
Right.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, the focus shifts pretty quickly from lost individuals to major adversarial nations. What are the biggest threats identified in the source material?
Well, the top adversaries listed are the Chinese Communist Party, the CCP Russia, and Iran.
And Iran is singled out.
Yes, the source specifically labels Iran the biggest holistic CT threat and the biggest kinetic threat. And then you have al-Qaeda, which is reportedly having a party in Afghanistan since the withdrawal.
Let's talk about Afghanistan, because the sources argue the U.S. withdrawal created security threats that go way beyond terrorism.
This is where the geopolitical and economic critiques really converge. The claim is that when the U.S. left, not only was weaponry left behind, but Russia and China moved in immediately.
To mine the minerals.
Specifically lithium and cobalt, essential materials for modern technology.
And this ties directly back to policy decisions here at home, the green energy push.
Absolutely. The source argues we have this massive green initiative that requires huge amounts of these materials for batteries and solar panels, but we're buying the components from China.
Who is getting the raw materials from places like Afghanistan and Congo?
And that, the source claims, makes the U.S. extremely vulnerable and totally dependent. The idea of economic self-sufficiency becomes a myth.
The source material uses a really visceral analogy for this supply chain.
They call it the modern-day blood diamond.
Wow.
Yeah. The claim is that while we celebrate these as clean energy components, the actual mining is done with, allegedly, no environmental oversight or ethical labor standards. The U.S. is being bamboozled, they say, by adversaries who are profiting and growing stronger off our dependence.
And let's circle back to Iran for a moment. There's a claim that the current administration financially enabled them.
The claim is that the Biden administration unfroze $7 billion that had been seized from Iran years ago.
And critics argue that money went straight to
funding adversaries like Hamas and Hezbollah, to speeding up their nuclear program, and to strengthening their alliance with Russia and the CCP against the U.S. The picture they paint is of three major adversaries coordinating their efforts against American weaknesses.
So if we connect this to the bigger picture, what we've synthesized is a situation where the tool designed to fight foreign threats, FISA, is compromised by internal abuse, the 278,000 searches.
While at the same time, our own policy decisions and economic dependencies are strengthening the very adversaries FISA is supposed to target.
It really highlights this dual vulnerability the country is facing.
It does. You have the deep institutional breakdown, the abuse of power, forcing this choice between security and liberty. And at the same time, the geopolitical landscape is darkening because of what critics are calling these self-inflicted wounds.
So, what does this all mean? The conversation about the electric battery supply chain, it leads to one final provocative thought from the source material.
It's a really interesting critique of the environmental cost. The source makes the specific claim that running a Ford pickup truck for 20 years does less damage to the environment than the creation and removal of a single electric battery at the end of its life.
And that's used to amplify the idea that the U.S. is being bamboozled.
Exactly. By adversaries who are profiting from these supply chain weaknesses that we accept for our own domestic initiatives.
Which leaves an important question for you, the listener, to really consider.
How deep does this vulnerability actually run? When your national security tools are being abused internally, while the essential components of your economy are tied to geopolitical rivals who benefit from that very reliance. The debate over FISA, the deep state, and the global supply chain, it turns out they're all fundamentally connected.
Don't forget to like and subscribe for the next episode on While We Were Distracted.